Alvin Boyd Kuhn once wrote that, quote, "The sacred scriptures of the world are 1,000 times more precious as myths than as alleged history," end quote. There was a time when I would have disagreed strongly with that statement. Now, however, I could not agree more. In the account of the fall given in Genesis chapter 3, there's a very clear progression of events. And it starts when the serpent leads Eve to decide that the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden is good to eat. And so then she takes the fruit thereof and eats, and gives also to her husband, and he eats. They're then expelled from the garden by the Lord God, who addresses each of the above players in that same order. First the serpent, then the woman, and then the man, whom he says will now return to the ground, dust to dust. Many, many myths involving a woman as an important figure can be shown to refer to the extremely important zodiac constellation of Virgo, the Virgin. And if she has a male consort of any type, he can often be shown to be played, as if in a play, by an actor, by the figure of Boötes, the herdsman. So Virgo and Boötes are like two famous actors who appear in many different movies, and then you say, wait, I recognize that actor, or I recognize, that I've seen that actor before in that other story. So Boötes is directly above Virgo in the sky, and that's from a perspective of an observer in the northern hemisphere. And Boötes is very close to Virgo, and that's why often in these myths, Boötes plays a husband and Virgo plays his wife or a lover and a maiden, things like that. I believe that this story of Adam and Eve is no exception. I believe that it can be shown that in the Genesis account, Boötes is playing the role of Adam, Virgo is playing the role of Eve, and there's actually a serpent constellation directly below Virgo. It's this long, sinuous constellation of Hydra, and Hydra, of course, is playing the role of the serpent. So here's a screen view from an open source planetarium app called Stellarium. It's a great app. So in this view, we are standing as an observer in the northern hemisphere, and we're looking towards the southern horizon. And so if we're facing south, that means east will be to our left, west will be to our right, and that means that the stars will be moving from left to right in an arc across the sky. That's east to west as the night progresses, just like the sun moves from east to west, and it makes an arc. It starts off in the eastern horizon, which is to our left as we're looking south here. It arcs up, and then it sinks down in the west, and the stars are going to do that same thing as the Earth rotates each day. So you can readily observe then that as these constellations move from the eastern horizon and head towards the western horizon, these three constellations, just the way they're laid out in the sky, with the serpent being the farthest west of the group, that serpent is going to be the one that leads the woman, and then the woman is going to actually lead the man. And that's exactly what happens in the Genesis account, which is why it's the serpent who first tempts Eve, and then it's Eve who takes the fruit first, and then she gives it to Adam. Now, the constellation Virgo has a very distinctive feature, and one that shows up time and again in myths throughout the world, in which Virgo is playing a leading role. And that distinctive feature of Virgo is her outstretched arm. This arm is marked by a star that's called Vindimiatrix, and that's a Latin word. It actually has a Greek origin, but it comes to us through Latin, and it means the grape plucker. It's actually a feminine term that Trix, trix, becomes tress in English. So it's actually the grape harvestress, or the grape, the female grape gatherer. That's what Vindimiatrix means. And if you look at this outline of Virgo and then use your imagination, you can realize why it is that Eve, who's played by the constellation Virgo in this play, is the one who reaches out to take the fruit. And of course the name of that star is a huge clue, because it refers to plucking fruit. So right after she reaches out to take the fruit, in the very same verse of Genesis 3, in fact, Eve gives it to her husband. And if you look at the way these constellations are laid out, Virgo's outstretched arm is going right towards Boötes. So you'll realize why in the story she hands the fruit to Adam to eat. So as we put the earth in motion, that will cause the heavens to start to move, or seem to move, as the earth rotates, and the stars begin to sink down towards the western horizon, and they're going to be cast out of the garden, cast out of paradise. And in Genesis 3, the Lord God addresses or admonishes each of the three players in the same order that these constellations are thrown out of the sky. First the serpent, then the woman, and then the man. And so you can see that the sky is actually the Garden of Eden. That's paradise. And then they get cast out. They get cast down to earth. And so if we quickly rotate over to the east, we will see Perseus is rising in the east. And there's your flaming sword bearing angel. That's the angel that's bearing the flaming sword. And he's at the east of Eden because he's rising up in the east as these constellations sink down in the west. So now let's turn to an equally foundational, fundamental story at the beginning of the New Testament. And that is the description of the birth of Jesus in the manger. The scriptures tell us that he is born of a virgin, of course, and so we can immediately suspect that the same important zodiac constellation of Virgo might be playing the role of the virgin in this New Testament story, just as in the Old Testament story of Adam and Eve. And again, following the analysis of Robert Taylor, he argues that indeed Virgo is playing the role of Mary, but this time Virgo is rising in the east. And the reason why he comes to that conclusion is there's the visit of the three magi, or the wise men from the east, described in Matthew chapter 2, who are often popularly known as the three kings. At the beginning of Matthew 2, we read, "Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him." Now, when Virgo is rising in the east, sinking down towards the west is the glorious constellation of Orion, with his distinctive belt of three stars, perhaps the most well-known group of stars in the entire sky. If these three brilliant stars are our wise men, or the three kings, then it makes perfect sense for them to say, "We have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him," seeing a star in the constellation Virgo. And so, what star is it that they've seen in the east? If we think about that distinctive aspect of the constellation Virgo, and remember that she has that outstretched arm marked by the star Vindimiatrix again, and envision Virgo as holding a child, then this star would be his star, which the three belt or stars of Orion, the three kings, can see in the east and recognize as the child. And there's some support for this argument. If you look at this statue from ancient Egypt of the goddess Isis holding her son, who is the god Horus, we can see that this is an example of how the sacred myths from around the world are all built on the same system of celestial metaphor. And in fact, the cycle of myths surrounding Isis and Horus and Osiris can be shown to have extremely strong connections to the Christ story of the New Testament. So here's a profile drawing of that same statue. This drawing is from the 1880s, and it shows Isis with the child Horus. And you can see the posture of Isis with her child is very similar to the outline of the constellation Virgo. And if we draw it in here, you can clearly see that that distinctive outstretched arm of Virgo can be imagined to be the arm that's holding the child, which is the young Christ child in the case of the Virgin Mary, or the young sun god Horus in the case of the goddess Isis. And that's the star seen in the east by those three kings, the belt stars of Orion. And there's another very strong additional piece of evidence that backs up this particular interpretation of the elements of the story, and that is that if you look at the planetarium screen here, or if you go out into the night sky when Virgo is rising in the east, you'll see that the zodiac constellation that is culminating or transiting, that is actually at the very highest point of the sky, directly above due south, crossing the highest point in the sky, just like when the sun crosses this point, we call that noon. Well, when Virgo is rising in the east and the Orion belt stars are sinking down in the west, we have Cancer the Crab, the zodiac sign of Cancer the Crab, directly at its highest point of transit or culmination due south. And Cancer is a very faint constellation, but a very important one. And in this story, the important aspect of Cancer is a beautiful cluster of stars that's found in the very center of the forehead of the crab, and it is known as the Beehive Cluster. And it's designated sometimes M44 in modern nomenclature, but it also had an ancient name that was Praesepe, and that in Latin meant the manger. And one reason that it might have been called the manger is it's located between two stars in the constellation Cancer whose names are Acellus Borealis, the northern donkey, and Acellus Australis, the southern donkey. So the manger, which is a feeding trough, is located between two donkeys. And of course, we all know that in the Christmas story, the baby Jesus was laid in a manger. So if we zoom in on the planetarium feature to get closer to the stars of the zodiac constellation Cancer, you'll see actually the two stars of the northern donkey and the southern donkey, and in between the beautiful Beehive Cluster. It's actually easier to see in the night sky than it is here in this planetarium map. It is visible with the naked eye, but with binoculars it's really brilliant, dazzling. So actually there's Cancer right there, right in the center of your screen, and as we zoom in you can see the two donkeys and then the beehive right in between them. As we zoom in there, the southern donkey, the label is about to pop up. There it is, that's the southern donkey, and then the Beehive Cluster right above that, and then the northern donkey, I just clicked on it there, so you've got like a target bullseye around. That's the northern donkey. In between is the beehive. So from these two fundamental stories, one from the beginning of the Old Testament, one from the beginning of the New Testament, we can make a very strong case that they are encoding the motions of specific stars and constellations. It's possible to argue that all these celestial correspondences are simply coincidence, but if you go through the stories of both the Old and the New Testaments, you can actually find similar correspondences time after time, and the case for coincidence becomes less and less likely. And in fact, this same system can be found in operation in myths and sacred stories around the world, from virtually every culture of humanity. And I'd also like to point out that this isn't new. Plato and Aristotle both hinted that this was in operation, and Plato actually has Socrates warn against literalizing or historicizing the myths in the dialogues of the Phaedrus, and Aristotle called these ancient myths the relics of an ancient treasure, he called them. In the Plato's dialogue of the Phaedrus, Socrates, when he's discussing this, points his listeners to the temple at Delphi, and I believe that's an important clue, because the temple of Delphi is where we read, "Know thyself." So this has something to do with understanding who we are. And the temple of Delphi is also a place where the boundary between the spirit world or the unseen world and this material world was crossed by the priestess of Delphi, who would go across in a trance state and bring back information from the other side. I believe that is a very important clue from Socrates via Plato as to what all of this might mean.